The bed was cold when Lawrence Hale, Duke of Westmere, woke on the first morning of his marriage. Not the ordinary cold of linen left too long without a body's warmth, but the particular, settled cold of a bed that had been empty for hours. He reached across the sheets without opening his eyes, as one does when the shape of a new arrangement has not yet become habit, and his hand found nothing. He opened his eyes. The pillow beside his own still bore the faint impression of her head. The coverlet on her side had been drawn back neatly, not thrown, folded, with the deliberate care of someone who did not wish to disturb. Her slippers were gone from beside the bed. The dressing gown that had been laid across the chair by the window was gone. The room smelled faintly of lavender water and cold hearth ash, and the quality of light through the curtains told him it was well past 8. He sat up. He was not alarmed. He was not, in truth, even particularly curious. They had retired late. The wedding supper had gone on past midnight, and by the time the last of the guests had been seen to their carriages, they had both been too exhausted for anything beyond a few murmured courtesies and the shared awkwardness of two people occupying the same bed for the first time. He assumed she had risen early and gone down to breakfast, perhaps eager to begin acquainting herself with the household. She had struck him, in their handful of meetings before the wedding, as the sort of woman who would want to be useful. He rang for his valet. He dressed. He went down to the breakfast room, where Seddon, his steward, was reviewing the morning's correspondence at the sideboard, and Mrs. Vickery, the housekeeper, was overseeing the arrangement of the chafing dishes with the particular attentiveness she reserved for mornings when the household had guests. "Has the Duchess come down?" Lawrence asked, reaching for the coffee. Mrs. Vickery's hand stilled on the lid of the nearest dish. She did not look at him immediately, and when she did, her expression carried something he could not read, something careful, something held. "No, Your Grace," she said. "She is not." He checked the morning room, the library, the long gallery where the previous evening's flowers were already beginning to drop their petals onto the marble floor. He sent a maid to knock at her dressing room door. The maid returned with a face drained of color and reported that the room was empty. Not disordered, empty. The wardrobe had been opened but not cleared. Most of the Duchess's trousseau remained, the silks and muslins hanging in their careful rows. But a plain traveling dress was missing, a wool pelisse, a pair of walking boots, a small leather case that had sat on the dressing table. No note, no letter, no message left with any servant. Phoebe Hale, née Drayton, who had been the Duchess of Westmere for precisely 14 hours, had vanished before dawn. The search was conducted with the discreet efficiency that only a household of Westmere's standing could manage. Seddon dispatched men to the village, to the coaching inn at Hatherwick, to the toll road. Lawrence himself rode the estate's perimeter, covering ground he had known since boyhood, scanning the hedgerows and field paths as though his wife of one night might be found sheltering beneath an oak like a lost ewe. She was not. No one at the coaching inn had seen a woman matching her description. No hire carriage had been engaged. The toll-keeper had recorded no solitary female traveler. By evening, Lawrence sat in his study with the door closed and his hands pressed flat against the surface of his desk, and faced the fact that he did not know where she had gone because he did not know her well enough to guess. He could not, he realized, with a shame that sat like cold iron in his chest, recall whether her eyes were gray or blue. The marriage had been arranged in the usual fashion. Sir Giles Drayton, a baronet of modest but respectable standing, had a daughter of marriageable age and a house that required more repair than his income could sustain. Lawrence required a wife because the title required an heir, and because his mother, before her death, had extracted from him the promise that he would not let the line end with his generation. Phoebe Drayton had been presented to him at a dinner given by mutual acquaintances. She was quiet. She was composed. She had a habit of looking at people with an attentiveness that he mistook for passivity. They had danced together at one ball, dined together on 3 occasions, and spoken privately twice, both times in the company of her father, who filled silences with practiced ease. Lawrence had proposed in the garden of the Drayton house on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with the roses not yet in bloom and a light rain beginning. She had accepted. He remembered that she had looked at him steadily when she said yes, and that he had thought, with satisfaction, that she was not the sort of woman who would make difficulties. He had never asked her what she wanted. The first month was the most dangerous. Lawrence could not report his wife missing to the magistrate without admitting, publicly and irrevocably, that his Duchess had fled on their wedding night. The humiliation would have been total. Instead, he put it about that she was unwell. A fever contracted during the wedding celebrations, nothing serious, but requiring rest and seclusion. Seddon managed the lie with the careful efficiency of a man who understood that discretion was the greater part of his duties. Mrs. Vickery said nothing at all, which Lawrence took for loyalty, but which was, in fact, something closer to guilt. He hired inquiry agents, discreet men who asked discreet questions in coaching inns and posting houses from London to the Scottish border. They found nothing. It was as though Phoebe Drayton had stepped out of his house and out of the world entirely. By the third month, the story of the Duchess's illness had calcified into accepted fact. Visitors were turned away. Letters of concern were answered with formulaic assurances. Sir Giles Drayton wrote twice, and Lawrence responded with such careful vagueness that the old man, who was not perceptive but was trusting, appeared satisfied. In the House of Lords, Lawrence sat through debates on the Corn Laws with the particular rigid attention of a man who is using public duty to wall off private chaos. By the 6th month, Lawrence stopped searching. By the end of the first year, he had begun to be angry. It was not the sharp, clean anger of a man wronged. It was something slower, something that accreted in layers like silt at the bottom of a still pond. He was angry that she had left without explanation. He was angry that she had made him feel foolish, that he, a man who prided himself on ordered judgment, had failed to perceive in his own wife whatever unhappiness had driven her to disappear. And beneath all of it was a question he could not stop asking. What had he done? He reviewed their every exchange. The ceremony had been unremarkable. The breakfast had been pleasant. She had smiled at appropriate moments and danced the first dance with a grace that surprised him because he had not thought to expect grace from her. In the carriage afterwards she had been quiet, but he had attributed that to fatigue. And later, in the bedchamber that had been prepared for them with fresh flowers and new candles, they had stood on opposite sides of the room and looked at one another with the cautious formality of two people who had agreed to share a life without ever discussing what that life might contain. He had said something to her then, something meant to be reassuring, meant to set the tone for what he imagined their marriage would be, practical, civil, unmarked by emotional excess. He could not remember the precise words. They had not seemed, at the time, worth remembering. She had looked at him. He remembered that. She had looked at him with those gray eyes. They were gray, he knew now, not blue, because he had spent 2 years remembering every detail he had failed to notice when it mattered. And something had shifted in her expression, something so subtle that he had not registered it as significant. A door closing, not slammed, not even pushed, simply allowed to swing shut on its own weight. They had gone to bed. He had fallen asleep. She had not. The discovery happened on a Thursday in October, 2 years and 5 months after the wedding. Lawrence was riding the western boundary with Seddon, reviewing drainage work delayed by the autumn rains. The tenant farms on the western edge were the oldest on the property, a cluster of stone cottages and small holdings that had been part of Westmere since the previous century. He visited them rarely. The tenants dealt with Seddon, who dealt with the rents and the repairs and the seasonal negotiations that kept the agricultural machinery of the estate in motion. They were passing the largest of the cottages, a stone building with a low slate roof and a kitchen garden that someone had recently turned and planted with winter greens, when Lawrence heard a sound that stopped him in the saddle. Children's voices, but not the ordinary shouts and quarrels of farm children at play. These voices were reciting, in unison. The rhythm of it was unmistakable. Someone was teaching them to read. He dismounted. Seddon, behind him, made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a warning. But Lawrence was already crossing the yard, already approaching the cottage door, which stood open to admit the thin October sunlight. The room inside was low-ceilinged and whitewashed, with a flagstone floor swept clean and a fire burning in the grate. A long table had been pushed against one wall, and around it sat 7 children of varying ages, the youngest perhaps 4, the eldest no more than 10. They had slates before them and chalk in their hands, and they were copying letters from a hornbook propped against a jug of late asters. At the head of the table, seated on a plain wooden chair with her back to the door, was a woman in a gray wool dress with her hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck. She was reading aloud from a battered copy of Aesop, and her voice, that particular voice, low and measured with the careful diction of a woman who had been taught to speak clearly but not loudly, filled the small room like something poured. Lawrence did not breathe. The girl nearest the door, a sharp-faced child of perhaps 8, with ink on her fingers and a direct assessing gaze, saw him first. She did not speak, but her eyes widened, and the boy beside her, A smaller child with a thatch of brown hair followed her gaze and went still. One by one, the children stopped writing and turned towards the doorway, and the silence spread across the table like a cloth being drawn. Phoebe looked up from the book. She did not gasp. She did not drop the volume or push back her chair or bring her hand to her mouth in the manner of a woman caught. She looked at him standing in the doorway of the cottage, travel-dusty, tall enough that his head nearly brushed the lintel, his riding coat dark against the October light behind him, and her expression was one he had never seen on her face before. Not fear, not guilt, not even surprise quite. Recognition. As though she had always known this moment would come and had simply been waiting to learn its shape. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice did not waver. "Tabitha," she said to the sharp-faced girl without looking away from Lawrence, "take the others outside, please. Jem, bring the slates. You may practice your letters in the yard." The children moved with the quiet efficiency of pupils who trusted their teacher completely. The sharp-faced girl, Tabitha, gathered the hornbook and the chalk-box. The brown-haired boy, Jem, collected the slates in a neat stack. A smaller child, a boy called Kit, who could not have been more than 5, looked back at Phoebe from the doorway with an expression of pure, uncomplicated loyalty before Tabitha steered him out into the yard. And then they were alone. 2 years. 2 years of silence, of searching, of questions that curdled into anger that curdled into something worse. 2 years during which he had imagined her in London, in Bath, in France, in any of the 1,000 places a woman might disappear to if she had sufficient determination and sufficient cause. And she had been here, 3 miles from his front door, on his own land, teaching his tenants' children to read from a copy of Aesop in a cottage with winter greens in the garden. "How long?" he said. His voice was not steady. "Since the beginning," Phoebe said. She closed the book and set it on the table beside the jug of asters. "Mrs. Vickery arranged the cottage. The tenants knew. No one spoke of it." "Mrs. Vickery." He repeated the name as though it were a word in a foreign language. "She found me in the kitchen garden on the morning I left. I had not planned well. I had nowhere to go and no means of reaching anywhere. She brought me here. She told the Marstons I was a cousin of hers, recently widowed. By the time the story needed amending, the tenants had decided for themselves what the truth was, and they chose to keep it." Lawrence crossed the room and stopped at the table. He put his hands on the back of the nearest chair and gripped it until his knuckles whitened, because the alternative was to say something he could not take back. "You have been 3 miles from me," he said, "for 2 years. Yes. On my land. Yes. Why?" She was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked. Outside, he could hear Tabitha's voice directing the younger children with a confidence that suggested she had assumed authority in this cottage many times before. "Because I had nowhere else," Phoebe said, "and because this was not yours, not in any way that mattered. You did not know this cottage existed. You did not know these children's names. This corner of your estate was as far from you as any place in England." He wanted to shout. He wanted to overturn the table, to scatter the slates and the chalk and the asters across the flagstones. He wanted to demand, with the full force of his rank and his right, that she explain herself in terms he could categorize and respond to. But she was sitting in that plain wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap and her gray eyes steady, and there was nothing in her bearing that invited volume. She was not defiant. She was not contrite. She was simply present, in a way she had never been during their courtship, in a way he had never given her room to be. "Why did you leave?" he asked. The anger was still there, but something had shifted beneath it, like a floor giving way under a weight it had held too long. She looked at him with an expression that might, in another woman, have been pity. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me on our wedding night?" He stared at her. He opened his mouth and closed it. "You said, 'I expect we shall manage well enough. You seem a sensible sort of girl.'" The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. He heard them. He recognized them, distantly, as sounds he might have produced. The cadence was his, the slightly formal phrasing, the instinct to reassure through diminishment. But he had no memory of saying them. They had passed through him and out of him without resistance, the way a man breathes without noticing. "I do not remember saying that," he said. "No," Phoebe said, "you would not." She stood. She moved to the window, where the thin October light fell across her face, and he saw the 2 years in her, not as damage, not as decline, but as definition. She was thinner. The softness that had rounded her cheeks at 22 had resolved into something sharper, more deliberate. Her hands were rougher. There was chalk dust on her cuffs and a small ink stain on her right forefinger that spoke of daily purposeful work. She was not the woman he had married. She was the woman who had existed beneath the one he married, the one he had never troubled to meet. I came into that marriage prepared to try, she said, still facing the window. I knew it was an arrangement. I did not expect love. I'm not a fool. But I expected to be seen, to be spoken to as a person and not a provision. When you said those words, manage well enough, sensible sort of girl, I understood that you had already decided what I was, that I would be managed, that I would be sensible, that I would occupy the place allotted to me and make no difficulties and require nothing of you beyond maintenance. She paused. I realized I could not bear it. So you left. So I left. Without a word. What word would have mattered? She turned from the window and looked at him directly, and there was no accusation in her voice, only a question so genuine it cut deeper than anger. If I had told you I was unhappy, you would have asked what I needed, and you would have provided it, and we would have managed well enough. That was the thing I could not endure. The managing. The well enough. He sat down in the chair he had been gripping. He sat down because his legs would no longer reliably support him, and because the room had taken on the quality of a space in which something is being dismantled, carefully, without violence, but completely. I searched for you, he said, for months. I know. I was afraid you were dead. She flinched. It was the first crack in her composure, and it closed almost instantly. But he saw it, and the seeing of it told him more than anything she had said. She had known what her disappearance would cost him. She had carried that knowledge for 2 years, and it had not been weightless. I'm sorry for that, she said quietly. It was not my intention to cause you suffering. It was my intention to survive. The silence that followed was long enough for the fire to settle, and the children's voices outside to fade, as though Tabitha had led them round to the far side of the cottage. Lawrence looked at the room, the swept floor, the careful arrangement of books on a shelf beside the hearth, the children's drawings pinned to the whitewashed wall with tacks. A sampler hung beside the door, stitched in a child's uneven hand. We read, and we are not afraid. He stared at it until the letters blurred. What do you want? He asked. The words came out rough, stripped of formality. Not a Duke's question, a man's. Tio. I want to continue teaching, she said. The children have no one else. Tabitha can nearly read independently now. Jem is beginning his numbers. Kit cannot yet hold his chalk properly, but he comes every morning without fail and sits in his chair and watches the others. And one day soon he will begin. She paused. I want to be known, not managed, known. If that is not something you are able to give, then I would ask to be left here in peace. He left the cottage without answering. He mounted his horse and rode back to Westmere in silence, and he did not speak to anyone for the remainder of the day. That evening, he summoned Mrs. Vickery to his study. She came without surprise, as though she too had been waiting for this conversation for 2 years. She stood before his desk with her hands clasped at her waist and her chin level, and her eyes, dark, shrewd, unapologetic, fixed on a point just past his left shoulder. You knew, he said. Yes, Your Grace. From the beginning. From the morning she left. I found her in the kitchen garden at 5:30. She was wearing her traveling dress and her pelisse, and she had her leather case, and she was standing by the gate looking at the park as though she had never seen it before. I believe she had intended to walk to the village. She had not considered what she would do when she reached it. And you hid her. I housed her, Your Grace. The Marston cottage had been empty since Michaelmas. It was clean and dry, and it had a good hearth. She needed somewhere to be, and I provided it. You lied to me. Mrs. Vickery was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a quality in it he had not heard before. Not defiance, but a refusal to pretend. I watched her on her wedding day, Your Grace. I watched her at the breakfast and at the supper, and in the hours between. I watched a young woman try, with everything she had, to be seen by a man who had already decided she did not require seeing. When I found her in the garden the next morning, I did not ask her why she was leaving. I did not need to. He dismissed her. He sat alone in his study until the candles guttered, and then he sat in the dark. He did not sleep that night. He lay in the same bed from which she had disappeared, staring at the canopy he had stared at 1,000 times, and he tried to remember the wedding night, not the events of it, which were unremarkable, but the texture of it, the quality of the air between them. He remembered her standing by the window in her white nightgown, her hair loosened, her reflection pale and indistinct in the dark glass. He remembered the silence and how he had mistaken it for contentment. He remembered speaking, saying something meant to be kind, meant to establish the parameters of their arrangement, and he remembered her expression afterwards. A door closing. He had seen it. He had registered it somewhere beneath conscious thought, in the part of the mind that notices what the will chooses to ignore. And he had let it pass, because it was easier than inquiry, because inquiry implied that her feelings were a country he would need to learn to navigate, and he had not signed on for navigation. He had signed on for management. I expect we shall manage well enough. You seem a sensible sort of girl. He said the words aloud in the dark room and heard them for what they were. He did not go back to the cottage the next day or the day after. He was not certain what he would say, and he had learned from her, from the space she had carved out of his own negligence, that words spoken without thought were the most dangerous kind. On the third day, he walked. He, not rode, walked through the tenant fields, past the drainage works, along the path that wound through the copse of beeches at the western edge of the park. He arrived at the cottage at 9:30, when the morning light was still low and golden through the trees. Through the open door he could hear Phoebe's voice, and the children reciting, and the scratch of chalk on slate. He did not go in. He stood at the edge of the yard, beside the kitchen garden with its rows of winter greens, and he listened. After the lesson ended and the children scattered, Tabitha striding off toward the Marston farmhouse with her hornbook under her arm, Jem pulling Kit by the hand towards the brook, Phoebe appeared in the doorway. She saw him and stopped. The light caught the chalk dust on her sleeve and the loose strands of hair at her temple, and she looked in that moment like a woman who belonged exactly where she was. "I did not come to demand anything," he said. "I came to ask if I might sit in." She studied him. The assessment in her gaze was thorough and unhurried, the same careful attention she gave to a child's first attempt at a letter, noting what was genuine, what was approximate, what needed work. "Tomorrow," she said. "They begin at 8. He came the next morning at 7:45. He sat on a stool by the hearth, too large for it, his knees absurdly high, his riding coat out of place among the chalk and the slates, and he watched his wife teach. He watched Tabitha read a full passage from Aesop without stumbling, her sharp face lit with a fierce private pride. He watched Jem trace the letter R 17 times until the curve satisfied him. He watched Kit sit in his small chair with his slate on his knees, holding his chalk in a fist, making marks that were not yet letters but that he regarded with the gravity of a scholar. He said nothing. He made no suggestions. He did not attempt to instruct or oversee or improve. He sat on his stool and he watched, and what he felt was not the anger he had carried for 2 years, but something far worse, the recognition of what had been available to him all along if he had only thought to look. He came back the following day, and the day after. On the 4th day, Kit approached him during the morning break and offered him a piece of bread and dripping without a word. Lawrence accepted it with a gravity that matched the child's own, and ate it, and said thank you, and Kit returned to his chair without further ceremony. Phoebe, watching from the table where she was sharpening a pencil with a small knife, said nothing. But her mouth moved very slightly in what was almost a smile. He began to learn, not the children's lessons, though he listened and found that Aesop's fables had a different resonance when heard in a whitewashed cottage among laborers' children than they had held in his boyhood schoolroom. But the thing Phoebe had understood from the beginning, that knowing a person required attention, and attention required stillness, and stillness required the surrender of the idea that you already understood what you were looking at. He learned that she took her tea without sugar, that she kept a sprig of dried lavender in the pages of whatever book she was currently reading, that she spoke to the children with the same measured respect she would give an adult, never condescending, never raising her voice. That Tabitha was her favorite, though she would not have admitted it, and that she worried about Kit's silence the way a gardener worries about a seedling that has not yet broken the soil. He did not ask her to return to the house. He did not mention the marriage or the title or the life she had walked away from. He brought things instead. A new copy of Aesop, because the old one had lost its spine. A box of proper chalk, not the crumbling sticks the children had been using. A bolt of warm wool for winter, left on the doorstep without a note, because he had learned from her that some things were better expressed without words. Weeks passed. The autumn deepened. The trees along the western edge of the park turned copper and gold and then bare, and the cottage hearth was lit earlier each morning, and the children came in their thickest coats, their breath clouding in the cold air. And still he came. It was Phoebe who spoke first. They were standing in the cottage garden after lessons on a cold November afternoon, the light already failing, the children gone home. She was pulling the last of the carrots from the kitchen bed, her hands reddened with cold, and he was standing beside her holding a basket because she had handed it to him without asking, and he had taken it without thinking. "You are not who I thought you were," she said, not looking up from the soil. "I was," he said. "When you left, I was exactly that man." She pulled a carrot free and placed it in the basket. "And now?" "Now I do not know. I am trying to find out." She straightened. She looked at him in the fading light, her face flushed with cold, her hands earthy, her gray eyes holding the same steady assessment they always held, but warmer now, or perhaps simply less guarded. "That is the first honest thing you have ever said to me," she said. She returned to Westmere in December, on a morning of hard frost when the park lay white and silent under a pale winter sun. She did not return as a woman reclaimed. She returned as a woman who had chosen, after long deliberation, to attempt something she was not certain would succeed. She brought her leather case, she brought her copy of Aesop, she brought the children's drawings which she pinned in the morning room where the light was best. The cottage school continued. Lawrence walked with her 3 mornings a week through the frosted park to the western fields and carried the basket of books and chalk and the small parcels of bread and cheese she brought for the children whose families could not always spare a midday meal. He sat on his stool by the hearth, and he listened, and in the afternoons he met with Seddon to discuss improvements to the tenant cottages, new roofing, better drainage, a commenting fund for boots and winter coats, and Seddon, who had managed the estate's business for 11 years without ever being asked about the tenants' children, adjusted to this new order with the quiet competence that was his defining quality. Mrs. Vickery remained. Lawrence did not dismiss her, and she did not offer to leave, and between them settled an understanding that was never spoken, but was as solid as the stone walls of the house. She had been right, and he had needed to be wrong before he could learn to be anything else. In the spring, Tabitha read her first full book, not Aesop, but Robinson Crusoe, borrowed from the Westmere Library, and presented herself at the kitchen door to inform Mrs. Vickery of this achievement with such solemnity that the housekeeper was obliged to sit down. Jem mastered his multiplication tables and announced his intention to become a surveyor. Kit, who had watched and waited with the patience of a child who understands that readiness cannot be rushed, picked up his chalk one February morning and wrote his name in clear, steady letters across his slate. Phoebe looked at the slate, and then at Kit, and then she turned away towards the window, and Lawrence saw her press her fingers to her mouth and understood that he was watching a woman witness the thing she had built. In June, Phoebe told him she was with child. She told him in the morning room, among the children's drawings, with the summer light falling across the table where she had been writing letters. He took her hand, carefully, as though it were something that might be withdrawn, and held it, and said nothing for a long time, because he had learned that the first words to arrive were not always the ones that should be spoken. Their son was born in January, in the same bedchamber from which Phoebe had disappeared 3 years earlier. They named him Giles, after her father, who came for the christening and stood in the chapel at Westmere, with tears on his weathered face and his best coat pressed and his hands shaking when he held the child. In the House of Lords that spring, Lawrence spoke in support of a bill to fund parish schools in rural districts. It was a brief speech, unremarkable by parliamentary standards, and it changed nothing in the short term. But he gave it, and the giving of it was its own kind of resolution. By the following autumn, the cottage school had 14 pupils and a second teacher, a clergyman's daughter from the neighboring parish whom Phoebe had trained herself. Tabitha, now 11, served as assistant on mornings when the younger children needed extra attention. Kit still came every day. He could read fluently now, and had developed a passion for maps that Lawrence indulged with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. On a warm evening in late September, Lawrence found Phoebe in the morning room, nursing Giles in the chair by the window. The last of the summer light was golden on her face, and the children's drawings surrounded her on the walls, years of them now, layered and overlapping, a record of small hands learning to make the world visible. "I never thanked you," he said from the doorway, "for repeating those words to me. In the cottage." She looked up. "Which words?" "The ones I said on our wedding night, the ones I had forgotten." He paused. "You could have told me sooner. You could have told me on the morning you left." "You would not have heard them," she said without reproach. "You were not yet a man who could hear them." He crossed the room and sat beside her, and their son made a small sound against her shoulder. and the house settled around them with the particular creak and sigh of old timber at the end of a long day. And outside the window, the park stretched away towards the western fields, where a stone cottage with a kitchen garden stood among the tenant farms, its door still open, its hearth still warm. He had not deserved to find her. That was the truth he carried quietly, without self-pity, as a fact of his history. She had not been lost. She had been 3 miles away, doing the work he should have seen the value of, building the life he should have offered, becoming the woman she had always been beneath the silence he mistook for compliance. He had not deserved to find her, but she had chosen, with clear eyes and full knowledge of who he was and who he was not, to let him try. The letter he had never written, the apology, the reckoning, the admission of everything he had failed to see, existed only in the things he did. The chalk he carried in his coat pocket, the path worn through the long grass between the house and the cottage, the way he said her name now, as though it were a word he had only recently learned the meaning of. They arrive here, like a path worn quietly through long grass whenever they are ready.